All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. For all of you that just joined the room, welcome. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat tengah hari dan selamat sejahtera. Welcome to the Roundtable on the New Economic Policy, NEP, Reflections on the NEP after 50 years. I am Zaim Mozani, Director of External Relations of KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific, KSI for short, and I'll be your free and untrained master of ceremony for this afternoon. This event is brought to you by KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific and the Economic Club of Kuala Lumpur, ECKL. Now, the NEP, staff topic, arising from the May 13 riot as a result of the huge economic disparity between the Malays and the non-Malays. The government introduced an affirmative action plan known as the NEP, National Economic Policy, in 1971. Its twin-pronged objectives are to eradicate poverty regardless of race, and to restructure society so that all ethnic groups will be represented in every profession and throughout the economy. This year, 2021, celebrates the 50th anniversary of the NEP. Over the years, the NEP has seen many iterations for the National Development Policy to Shared Prosperity Vision, SPV 2030. Yet all of these programs and policies have not necessarily contributed to national unity. Society has remained skewed and polarized, with many issues still unresolved and in fact exacerbated not just amongst the racial groups, but also within the ethnic groups. This webinar will be covering important questions. The first question will be on, did the NEP achieve its objectives? Was it successful? If not, where did it go wrong? Sorry, let me just, okay, thank you for that. Second question, sorry, let me just repeat the first question. The first question was, did the NEP achieve its objectives? Was it successful? And if not, where did we go wrong? Second question will be on 50 years later, is the NEP still relevant? Is the NEP an affirmative action for Bumipur Trust still needed in the 21st century in the context of IR 4.0, in the context of major shifts in political, economic, sociological, and also technological environments? And the last question, third question, is how can the NEP be reformed? If the NEP is to be replaced, what should take its place as an alternative? These are very big, important questions, and I'm sure the panel that we have today will be more than ready to deep dive into these questions. But to kick off the session, we have a very important person, the president of KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific, KSI, aka my boss, Tan Sri Malkayo. And Tan Sri Malkayo, the floor is yours for the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Zaim. Yang berbahagia Dato Sri Mohamed Iqbal, Chairman of the Economic Club of Kuala Lumpur, our moderator for this afternoon, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to today's webinar and to thank the 5 distinguished speakers for taking your time off to be with us and to share your valuable thoughts and insights with the participants this afternoon. Today, the eve of Malaysia Day, I think it's very apt and timely for us to reflect on the NEP after 50 years of implementation. I think the webinar should be able to take stock of the achievements and successes of the NEP, as well as identify its weaknesses and shortcomings. I think it will be very useful at the very outset of our discussions today to recall the 2 key thrusts of the NEP, or the 2 limbs as they wrote it at that time. Firstly, the restructuring of society to eliminate the identification of race with vocation or geographic location, and secondly, the elimination of poverty irrespective of race. There are also 2 basic assumptions that were taken into account when the NEP was first formulated. And firstly, it is based on a growing economic pie. Secondly, no one community need to experience any sense of loss. I think these are 2 very important basic assumptions in the formulation of the NEP. The NEP also is supposedly to have a 20-year time frame, 1970 to 1990. And I remember that in 1989, the then Prime Minister, Dr. Mahathir Mohamed, set up the first National Economic Consultative Council, or MAPN1, to help formulate a post-1990 policy. I was one of the members appointed to this MAPN1. 10 years later, the Prime Minister again set up MAPEN 2 to come up with another new policy to replace the new development policy that supposedly came into effect from the year 1990 onwards. So there already been two National Economic Consultative Councils to formulate what was supposed to be post-NEP policies. Perhaps it might be time for us to reflect and to think whether it is time now to have a MAPEN 3 or a third National Economic Consultative Council to take the country forward as part of the national recovery strategy post-COVID. So these are some preliminary thoughts I'd like to share here to set the stage for discussions by our distinguished panelists. I'm delighted now to hand the floor to our moderator, Yang Berbahagia Dato Sri Muhammad Iqbal. Dato Sri.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Michael. Assalamualaikum dan selamat tengah hari to all who are with us, the panelists, very distinguished people. It is very much appreciated that you are able to join us this afternoon to address some of the key points which Tan Sri Michael mentioned about this 50-year-old growing still, not younger anymore, old. And for those who are joining us in the virtual platform, welcome to all of you. The number is growing, I think nearly passing 300 over. It shows your keen interest to follow the discussions. And we have, to some extent, open up the discussions for the benefit of the public, so to speak. Those who are following us, we consider you as public, very interested parties. And those of you who have followed the invitation letter earlier were able to give us some thoughts, some comments, and some questions for the panelists to address some of the views. Thank you very much for this. I, on my part, as a moderator, have been given this opportunity. I want to thank Tan Sri Michael and his secretariat, Caroline and Zaim and others who have been able to put this up together to have these fruitful discussions. I just want to touch on not the background leading to, Tan Sri Michael has mentioned about it. We all know that it is 1971. We know the background which led to the 1971 formulation. At that particular time, nevertheless, it was considered as a bold and visionary economic partnership. It took into consideration two things, broadly, not exhaustive: the historical perspective of the plight of the Malays and the Bumiputras. They were part and parcel of the country. And second, the ramifications of the May 13, 1969 incident. That gave rise to, without going to the in-depth on the other circumstances and also the policy framework, the NEP during its implementation, I think the expert views that will be put forward today will show that to some extent it harped on the 30% equity partnership. There was a wholesome policy, but it swung to one component part of it, the 30% equity partnership, which remains to date as the core component of the policy. And whether it is MAPEN 1 or MAPEN 2, it will come back to harp on this. In essence, the objective of Bumiputra participation in commerce, business and industry, and generally in entrepreneurship is underachieved. I think we keep on being reminded that this is underachieved despite the proliferation of agencies and units tasked to improve, to better the situation. As chairman of the Malaysian Institute of Management at one point in time, we examined this area and we were shocked to find there were no less than about 70 institutions trying to do to improve the situation which continuously being said to be underachieved. The advancement of Malays and Bumiputras in education, I think this would be a very important component to any future policy making, leading to professional qualifications and employment is significant. I think we have seen a very good growth curve into that one. The recognition of education as a priority, still more to be done to create Bumiputra professionals with enhanced personal wealth is a testimony to at least a component part of the NEP, although it is not part of the wholesomeness. The continued fixation of macroeconomic ownership does not address the Bumiputra personal wealth. Bumiputra enterprises development, increasing personal wealth through active engagement in economic activities at the micro level. Of course, a lot of argument will come up. I hope it will come up. The trusted relationship of the government-controlled or the government-linked companies that does not fully account for the wealth of the Bumiputra community. By and large, in a way, the NEP has achieved some aspects of its objective. However, this achievement in actual terms, embracing the entire Malaysian Bumiputra community is suspect. And with COVID pandemic impacted on economic conditions, the vulnerability is more drastic among the rural and agrarian communities, especially the Bumiputras. This will be the reality of the day. The reset, which we are talking about after 50 years, has to seriously address these issues. The reset is critical to success of the shared prosperity vision we are talking about for up to 2030, which justifies to some extent the continuation of the NEP under whatever nomenclature we intend to perpetuate it. But there is a but. The reset of shared prosperity vision should focus on the issue not as a political desirability, but as an economic necessity on all communities, not leaving out any other communities which form the Malaysian multi-racial fabric. If this notion is not taken on in our future, whether it is going to be the up to 2030 or beyond, even next 50 years, we may not be around, but when we look at it, we will find that the NEP has not achieved its objective in whatever. That being my introductory remarks, I have great pleasure in inviting the panelists one by one. I will not be able to dictate. I'll just follow what KSI has given me the roll call according to the invitation program, and I will go with that order. And I would like to invite Tan Sri Dato Muhammad Sharif bin Kassim. He doesn't require any introduction. He's a great veteran of the civil service, and then he comes out of the civil service after excellent service contribution to the country. He has been a vocal writer and commenter on issues, and he will be a very able person to initiate this roundtable discussion or webinar, as you call it, to give us some perspective, historical, current, and then looking forward to. Tan Sri?
Thank you very much, Dato Sri Iqbal, and all those who are listening to this webinar. Welcome. As I informed earlier, I will be speaking from the text in order to present it in an orderly manner. May I begin now? The introduction of the NEP in 1970 and its incorporation into the development programs started from the Second Malaysia Plan 1971-75. There were mixed views from the very beginning. While most welcomed the NEP because of the events that happened in 1969, others had misgivings what it would mean, especially for the business community. As Malaysia had always been a free enterprise economy, there were fears that economic growth would suffer under the NEP. At the end of the 1970-1990 20-year period of the NEP, the government set up a National Economic Consultative Council to discuss the post-1990 policy. Despite the recommendations in the NECC for a change in the post-1990 policy, the cabinet in the end decided the NEP should continue as in the original form. But the government was also pragmatic, I would say, because along the way, especially after the twin deficit recession in 1985-86, and the more serious recession following the East Asia financial crisis in 97-98, the government began to realize that the NEP rules and regulations regarding the structuring of equity ownership to create a Bumiputra commercial and industrial community were too rigid on the private sector and not market friendly. There were double standards in the equity restructuring rules as foreign companies were exempted, giving rise to complaints about unfair treatment of local companies. Finally, the government decided to abolish the regulatory committees like the ICA, FIC, and CIC to improve the investment climate in the country. And most of it happened, I must say, during Tun Daim's time as finance minister. Today, we find many Chinese and Indian-owned companies having Malay partners and board directors and Malay executives, not because of government directives, but because it makes business sense for them to have diversity of race in their operations, particularly as Malays are now more visible than before in the marketplace as customers, suppliers, and distributors. From the beginning, the government focused its attention on the first prong of the NEP, on reducing unemployment and poverty, as this was agreed by all as fundamental for bringing unity among the various races. This was also the view in the EPU. As I said, I was serving in the EPU at that time. Right from the start in 1970, as we were preparing for the second Malaysia plan, the EPU pushed for a much bigger public sector role in the economy by increasing sharply the public expenditure program. EPU economists believe that with higher government spending on development, this would make our growth prospects stronger. The objective was to achieve a high GDP growth rate of 8% per annum over the 1997 period to create jobs, reduce unemployment, and eliminate absolute poverty. By 1990, all these NEP objectives were achieved. The regional disparities between rural and urban areas narrowed down as the big expenditures on development brought more public services such as education, health, water, roads, bridges, electricity, telecommunication to the less developed states and the interior regions, giving all Malaysians better access to the amenities of modern life. And the country achieved these targets with financial stability. Unlike many developing countries, Malaysia was able to finance its development without much foreign borrowing. We had enough domestic savings, thanks to the country's rich natural resource base and its strong export sector with primary commodities, forestry products, and oil, and later manufacturing export also generating the trade surpluses. The rising levels of rural incomes not only benefited Malay households, the shopkeepers in nearby towns also benefited from the rising purchasing power of rural areas. For example, I come from Kedah, so I know. For example, Sungai Petani and Alustar in Kedah benefited from the large Muda irrigation scheme for double cropping of paddy. While in Pahang, Felda's big Jangka Triangle new land development settlement project, by the way, both were funded by the World Bank also. This project made Bentong and Mentakap into more prosperous towns. And most of the towns, they have a very large Chinese population. With household incomes rising and strengthening the domestic market, and as the urban centers became better served with modern infrastructure, the industrial, commercial, and service sectors grew to enable the country to become one of the fastest growing countries among the newly emerging countries. However, as noted in the new economic model report, while the country can be proud of its achievements, other East Asian countries, which once were poorer than us, have climbed up to become high-income advanced countries. While they have become Asian tigers, Malaysia remains trapped as an upper middle income country. This suggests that although we achieved high growth rates, there was not much improvement in the skills of the human resources and the productive levels of its workforce to produce quality growth. Our productivity is lower than in the Asian tiger countries. In addition, there is brain drain due to outmigration of talented professionals to other countries, especially Singapore. This can be partly attributed to families migrating to English-speaking countries for the sake of their children's education. Another reason is that well-qualified Malaysians are looking for better salaries abroad, as salaries in Malaysia are too low for their high qualifications. Some migrated because they felt there is racial discrimination under the NEP, especially in the public sector. Whatever the reason for the slowdown in growth in the last 20 years, the fact suggests Malaysia needs to do a lot of reforms to take the country to a higher level of development based on science, technology, and English proficiency, as these are the basic requirements to raise productivity and efficiency in order to sustain the growth momentum and make us a high-income country. The East Asian financial crisis in 97-98 and the recession which followed exposed the structural weaknesses in the implementation of government policies, including the NEP. Many of these weaknesses were attributed to the system of governance, which allowed the nepotism, cronyism, favoritism, and corruption to spread with little checks and balance from the institutions. The lack of transparency and accountability in the award of contracts, licenses, and business permits especially to political favorites, relatives, and friends, made many to question the growing cost to the taxpayers in implementing the NEP. I therefore agree with the view that after 50 years of implementing the NEP, and with the vast expansion of education and training opportunities, and the increasing number graduating from top universities, the Malays are now better able to find their own way to success in the modern industrial and commercial sectors of the economy. So the policy of preferential treatment for Malays should be reviewed so that they will be encouraged to compete on their own merits. In fact, from what I can observe, young Malays today don't like to apply for office jobs anymore, like in the old days. They prefer the rough and tumble of doing their own thing. With the digital transformation in the country, I see them doing amazing things to earn a living in partnership with their friends, whatever the race they may be. So I believe the new generation can take care of their own life. One area which needs urgent reform, of course, I must mention, is the GLC sector. Some of the GLCs are important to the country because of their developmental role and their strategic importance to the economy. The 20 top GLCs, the top 20 GLCs are also a good training ground for Malays to become corporate executives. These good GLCs should be retained, but those that are not essential and are non-performing should be closed down because many of them are creating problems for the private sector because of unfair competition. Many of these bad GLCs are at state level, mainly under the SEDC, State Economic Development Corporations, and they are not self-funding. Lately, some GLCs are becoming too politically connected in the appointments to board positions. The country's reputation in good corporate practices will go down if the politicization of GLCs is not stopped. Hopefully, when the 12th Malaysia Plan is stable, the government will announce the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030 to do away with the negative aspects of social engineering and focus instead on an inclusive policy based on needs instead of race. All Malaysians recognize the need for government intervention to help the poor and the needy. Because in any country, whether east or west, north or south, despite the high growth rates in the economy, there will always be certain segments of the population who need help because of circumstances beyond their control. Where the need is justified, help should be given, irrespective of race or religion. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tan Sri. Thank you for your elucidation, I would say. Well done. The importance that I want to mention here is that Tan Sri Sharif Kassim speaks from his experience, the wealth of experience. He is not at the moment a government person speaking the government view or something like that. It is very open, and some comments are coming in and saying that you are very balanced in your analysis. The more important thing is that the initial stages, the 1971 to 1990, you mapped out very clearly the successes. After that, what happened? And one disaster after another comes up, then we are pushed down and lose our competitiveness. And whether this is good for the country everybody agrees it is not good for the country. Whether it is good for the Malays, it is not good for the Malays. Maybe some Malays, some Bumiputras benefit from it. And then this is clouded in the whole scenario by lack of integrity, and also what you have said is a system of governance and the lack of transparency and the other, and you have rallied for the stopping of the so-called social engineering. And some comments online are coming saying that even Malays are saying we want to do it our own way without any government stick to help us. Thank you very much, Tan Sri, for your very good analysis. People have been following. And so the next one I want to invite is Dato Sri Muhammad Nazir bin Tun Abdul Razak. The name Nazir itself is good enough, but when it is associated with a great leader of our country, Tun Abdul Razak, who in fact at the time of the crisis was the Prime Minister. He became Prime Minister and then instrumental for a lot of these policy changes, in particular some aspects of it even before the introduction of the NEP on the rural sector, rural and agrarian sector. So I don't want to go to the complexity of how prominent he is, but everybody knows that his CIMB role was very, very critical at a very critical time. And then he is now taken on a lower profile, but now still very much involved in the capital market. With that introduction, Dato Sri, can we have your comments and presentation?
Assalamualaikum. Thank you, Dato Sri Iqbal, and thank you, for inviting me. And thank you, Tan Sri Sharif, for that overview of the NEP from someone who was deeply involved in implementation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. You asked me to speak for 10 minutes, so I'm trying to get 10 points out in 10 minutes and at the same time try to minimize any duplication with what Tan Sri Sharif mentioned. So here goes. Firstly, I think it's very important as we reflect on NEP after 50 years, that it be assessed based on the context at the time of its formulation. There had been several racial clashes in the mid-60s, and in 1967, in Parliament, Tunku Abdul Rahman said, we are, as a nation, sitting on a keg of gunpowder that could explode anytime. Malays were expressing frustrations about the lack of economic opportunities, and the non-Malays were expressing frustrations about what they perceived as racially biased policies back then. So of course, in '69, we did have the explosion, a total breakdown in civil order, and the NEP was part of a series of bold reforms to get the nation back on its feet, to bring back democracy as well as the economy. After similar breakdowns in other countries, right, like Sri Lanka and so on, what they got was either persistent disorder or prolonged authoritarianism. That Malaysia suffered neither is in part a tribute to the new economic policy. The second point is that the NEP was first and foremost about creating the economic foundations of Malaysian nationhood. The Westminster cum laissez-faire system that we inherited at independence wasn't delivering. The economic disparities were extremely stark and had to be corrected before our communities can come together as one nation. I think it is hard to argue against this logic, although obviously some people still do. The NEP was heavily debated at the National Consultative Council then, and the policy was championed by many non-Malays like Tan Yeo Hong and Ramon Nabaratnam and others. And as you know, even last year, in a private conversation with Tun Michael Chen, who was the leader of the MCA back then, he reflected and said to me, he said, without the new economic policy, there would be no Malaysia, for it would have been consumed by the disaffected Malays. The third point I want to make is that the NEP did not cause racial politics. the colonial legacy was of a plural and segregated community of races, and race became the principal mode of political organization long before. And of course, we know that the special position of the Malays started back in the 1920s, and the constitution also built in the special position of Malays. So our founding fathers were on a mission to actually build a Malaysian nation. And the NEP was very much in line with that agenda, even though today, 50 years later, it's very hard to see it that way after all that has happened. Clearly, to me, the NEP, alongside some of the other structural reforms at the time, like the Rukun Negara and so on, brought much needed political stability, strong economic growth, accelerated poverty alleviation, and an educated and expanded Malay middle class. Many of these were described by Tan Sri Sharif earlier. NEP wasn't just about affirmative action. It was also about getting accelerated growth, because they realized that the distribution needed to come from accelerated growth. Otherwise, you'd end up taking some from one community to feed the other. And therefore, you have a slew of other policies like the shift to export orientation, free trade zones, etc., which is well covered in the book entitled Driving Development, which is edited by Professor Rajah. It's here, Prof. I can advertise the book for you. So to me, if we look at, if we take stock at 1990 of NEP, I think we would reflect on a very successful policy when we measure by economic growth, poverty eradication, and so on. But of course, we didn't hit the 30% target. And I'm not sure whether we needed to, but we didn't hit it. And of course, we didn't really produce as many Malay businessmen. But if you look at the Malay accountants, Malay bankers, Malay doctors, etc., no less than any other community. So in many respects, NEP in 1990, in my opinion, should have been ended or significantly overhauled. And as Tan Sri Sharif has revealed, that was actually the recommendation of the Economic Council then. So unfortunately, it continued, and the NEP, we must recognize, brought a lot, some negative side effects. A lot of good things, but as usual, it's always double-edged, brought some negative side effects. At the micro level, affirmative action certainly hardened the racial divide. It also brought about more opportunities for corruption, and it brought concentration of power in UMNO as well as, and especially in the Prime Minister's office. As to me, as the policy was prolonged, these negative side effects gained momentum. And when I think about these side effects, I mean, certainly one could argue they had much to do with how the policy was implemented, but not entirely. And I would highlight three major design shortcomings of the NEP. One, I think with the expanded role of the state in the economy, the government should have strengthened anti-corruption mechanisms. They did some with the formation, I think the ACA and all that then, but not enough. Two, I think whilst the second Malaysia plan talked about the Bumiputra commercial and industrial community, the 30% corporate equity ownership took a life of its own. Tan Sri Sharif mentioned this, but I'd also add that the extension after 1990 coincided with a bull run in the stock market, and the equity target, this equity target became the get-rich card for the Bumiputra. You actually didn't need to work very hard. You just needed to get some shares at a discount from the government or from the non-Malay community. And needless to say, money politics and corruption went on overdrive. And as I said, hard work became optional for Malays. I can have lots more to say on this 30% target, but probably too detailed for here. The third shortcoming I would like to highlight was that the NEP did not really look at the proper exit strategy. I actually don't know. I think it was too simplistic to say after 20 years we will just end it. I actually don't know of any affirmative action program across the world that actually was switched off. And in most cases, those are affirmative action for minorities. In this case, I think Malaysia and South Africa have affirmative action for majorities. So definitely no historical precedent. So I think the authors should have thought about how you switch it off after 20 years. And of course, we didn't manage to. Next point I just want to make is to give some thoughts about where we go from here. Now, the NEAC, the National Economic Action Council of 2010, comprising some of our very best minds, chaired by Amir Sham, including Andrew Sheng and many others, came up with the idea of a new economic model and a needs-based, market-friendly affirmative action framework. Help everyone in need, the vast majority are Bumiputra anyway. That would mean the differentiator of economic support changes from race to income and wealth. In my view, many Malay professionals I know will actually be happy with this because I think they're fed up of being seen as beneficiaries of a handicap. Yeah, when actually, in their professions and all that, they're top of class anyway. But a small and powerful group of people who benefit from this nexus between business and politics would obviously not want this, which is why the new economic model failed to get any traction in the first place. They are also the ones who use the new economic policy's basis of being anointed to a position or being awarded contracts. I could, for instance, never understand why in the name of the new economic policy, contracts had to be given by direct negotiations. Why couldn't contracts set aside by Bumiputra be tendered competitively between Bumiputras, right? The answer simply, it's politics. Now, it is not true, my eighth point, is that it's not true that this kind of politics is just the purview of UMNO. It might seem so because the system evolved with them and they stayed in power for the longest. However, we had subsequent governments, PH, PN, who perpetuated with the system. Vested interest in the present system is very strong. And note that the people who want to preserve this system are also not just the Malays or Bumiputras. I have been calling, therefore, for recalibration or a national reset. I don't think reform can be done piecemeal. They tried it before with the NEM, but now we tried many reforms. The PH government tried reforms. I don't think you can do reform piecemeal because it's very easy to wrap every reform proposal in race and religious narratives. So, to Michael's point about MAPEN 3, I would say that MAPEN 3 will not do. I think what we need is a holistic, something like a deliberative assembly to look at nationhood as a whole, the system as a whole, and not just the economic side, because it's all intertwined. Now, in a reset, I think we need to look at things holistically. The realignment and strengthening of institutions, separation of politics and business, GLCs, the political funding reforms, these are very key. And certainly within that, I would support affirmative action based on needs and a much bigger safety net. And my final point is this. We as a nation need to acknowledge that diversity doesn't come naturally. Humans are tribal, and we are not going to make the Malaysian tribe overnight. So at the start of my career at CIMB, I was the diversity employee. And it was clear to me that my bosses were quite happy to let me continue to be the token Bumiputra and they changed their approach only because of external pressure. Like gender diversity, we would need to have rules on diversity that apply across corporate Malaysia, not in government, but also in the private sector. So you apply rules to ensure diversity, like we have gender diversity and so on government companies, but also to the likes of Public Bank, Hong Leong, and so on. If we truly want a better, fairer Malaysia, I think everyone needs to step up and do their part. Thank you, Dato Sri. I hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you, Dato Sri. I think your punchline, a better and fairer Malaysia, I think this is our exercise today, this afternoon, is to see how best the reset would be able to give us, the views would give us the sort of contributions to make a better Malaysia. So thank you very much. I think some of the points that Dato Sri Nazir has raised, I won't say contentious, but would be taken up for some sort of a discussion, not necessarily in this panel. I think this panel to some people out there might look like it is a skewed panel, people of one mind trying to put or generate an idea to change the NEP to suit certain ways, but others would not agree with it. So be it, but we would be able to take on some of the points and interact at a later time. So the third speaker we have lined up is Dr. Hwok-Aun, Senior Fellow, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore, and Senior Fellow, the Institute of Democracy and Economic Affairs, ISEAS in Malaysia. He has been doing extensive research and papers, and he is in consultation with many of the active players in this area, political or otherwise academic. And so he would share some of his thoughts, how we would be able to take on this reset and contribute to it in a better way. Dr. Lee?
Thank you so much, Dato Sri, and good afternoon, good morning, whatever time it is where you are logging in to this session. It's a pleasure for me to be here and an honor to be able to share some thoughts on the NEP at 50. And I will have slides, will just help me get through quite a lot of material. And also I think maybe with my perspective being a little bit different, also just to get the point across. I want to look back critically on the NEP, to put in place some building blocks to then present what I think can be a framework for building what I call a cohesive Malaysian society. Now, I think we want to start in retrospect by appreciating the NEP's strengths in a specific way. But it's been already, let me just reiterate what has been already said a few times, but we can appreciate it when we actually see it in full. The two prongs were to eradicate poverty irrespective of race, and the second to accelerate social restructuring, to eliminate the identification of race with economic function. What I think we need to appreciate anew is how the two prongs made distinctions in terms of the objectives and the instruments. So I guess it will be cluing in that my angle is a little bit more of a public policy perspective. I'm trying to be systematic in how we look back on the NEP and then look forward. So the first prong, right, had a clear objective of reducing poverty for all. Another element there is the instrument that was used, which is the provision of basic needs, such as basic schooling, public health, and so on, and also how it operated through universal provision, where the principle of equality actually can apply, is actionable, and is intervening in areas where there are zero or low barriers to entry. So you think about primary schooling, you don't need any grades, you don't need to clear any grades to get into primary schooling. So the contrast, I hope we can begin to see with the second prong, which was principally about promoting participation of the Bumiputras, opportunity and achievement in 4 specific areas, especially higher education, high-level occupations, enterprise, and ownership. I think we are aware of this, but I think it helps when we frame it in a more coherent manner like this, I hope, right? And so we can see the contrast there with a key element of the instrument, how it operated was through preferential treatment, primarily based on identity. And in contrast to a universal provision, these were group-targeted interventions. They are trying to overcome barriers to entry. So to contrast the primary schooling with higher education, where the second prong really kicks in, where affirmative action really kicks in, because you cannot just simply open up and make it universal. There are barriers to entry, you have to clear certain grades, right? It's also scarcity, there are limited spaces, and there's specialization. So it's a different realm, a different domain that does require a different approach between the first and the second prong, the objectives and the instruments. But I think we need to appreciate that, but there's a lot that we can critique. I want to draw on I want to focus on 2 main issues here. So although the NEP, and the quotation marks here are taken from the 1971 Second Malaysia Plan, which presented it was the sort of the vision statement of the NEP, that the 2 prongs are interdependent and mutually reinforcing. That was actually a very astute principle, but it was not clear about how it actually operated. So it didn't really specify again that the second prong involves higher education, high-level occupations, enterprise, and wealth ownership. And it didn't really grasp that what we can term as need or helping the poor, merit, which is sort of, promoting capability and competitiveness. They coexist with identity in allocating opportunity. And they operate differently in these four different sectors. It was a bit too vague about that. And the ultimate objective, now again, this is the quotation marks from the NEP document, to aspire for Bumiputras to be full partners in economic life. Now, it was, again, very ambiguous about that. I don't want to be too harsh on the NEP because it was, obviously it was 1971. It was, a lot of still the political situation. There was not very much to refer to. It was in flux, right? But still, it was not very clear. And it did not focus enough, I think, on developing capability, competitiveness, and confidence. It allowed, yes, as was said earlier, that 30% Bumiputra equity agenda to dominate. So I am emphasizing quite a lot the sector specificity, meaning to say that in the areas where it is principally involved, higher education, employment, enterprise, and wealth ownership, that they need also specific targets and timelines. So the NEP, without giving that kind of adequate emphasis on how each sector needs to have specific treatment, which had a consequence that there cannot be a single monolithic end date. Now, what is really interesting here, you go back to 1971, again, the document, it actually recognized that there are differences. So in its here, to quote, regarding the Malay commercial and industrial community, it was then called Malay, subsequently Bumiputra, it may require more than a generation or more for their accomplishment. So it was aware that some things take longer than others. Some things may take longer than 1990, but it didn't follow through. It didn't really put it together in a systematic way. Now, what actually happened as well after 1971 was many programs, they actually unfolded in a piecemeal manner. It was not like one big bang in 1971. So we cannot even expect that by 1990 in one big bang, it can be dismantled. Even if you take 20 years as a valid kind of a timeline, there was one university in 1971. If you take, it could do affirmative action for 20 years. Okay. What about University of Utara Malaysia that was founded in 1984? Should it only have also end in 1990? It's affirmative action. So that kind of lack of clarity, I think, has harmed the discourse from the official standpoint. I guess maybe from our own standpoint and our participants in public discourses, I think we need to have a bit more of a self-examination and be critical about the bias and misstep that we also have committed. So while the NEP did set sort of that precedent about 1990 as one monolithic expiry date, we perpetuated it. I think moving forward, we need to focus not so much on this, confrontational, dogmatic pro-NEP, anti-NEP, or perpetuate it or terminate it, but focus on certain enduring principles, which I will outline a bit more later. Now, this is the second point, and it's quite a forceful that I'm going to make and maybe a bit contentious, but I'm going to back it up a bit. With this view, right, that I think has maybe had more relevance in some time in the past, but if we cling to that, if this is the premise, I think it's really misguided. The view that the NEP only benefits the Malay elite and it fails the masses. Now, I see that I can trace it back to the 1990s. At a time, there was privatization, there was runaway wealth accumulation, you had all these Malay corporate titans. But it's less relevant post-Asian financial crisis. I'm not saying that it's not a problem, it's a very important problem, and it's associated with some of the worst things about the NEP and affirmative action. But we shouldn't superimpose that one dimension on the entire system, right? To tie the whole thing with the same brush. And the problem itself is also, I think, overblown and it's empirically not substantiated if we look at the more recent data. So moving forward, I think we need to, rather than focus on that kind of hyperbole, to recognize that the system is very extensive in its outreach and focus again on Bumiputra and expanding to disadvantaged groups, focusing on opportunity, mobility, capability, and again with sector-specific timelines and targets. Now, another point of contention that I have is that the view of need and merit as a replacement. I resonate with the underlying philosophy, the moral basis, and it has an intellectual appeal. But when it's often presented, as often we hear it in a sweeping kind of system-wide, as a sweeping system-wide alternative to the race-based policies that are existing, I think that is really flawed. Now, let's observe this as well, or take note, right, that in recent years, we have seen in Malaysian society increasing awareness of basic rights. We've seen an expansion of social protection. So universalist programs have already been expanding. Now, we have paid attention to upward mobility of Indians, orang asli, women, and other identified groups through group-based, group-targeted programs. So, you know, I think we often get into a bit of double standards or inconsistency where if we're opposed to pro-Bumiputra group targeted, but we welcome women targeted, we welcome Indian targeted, we welcome orang asli targeted. I think it's better moving forward to broaden the universal basis, universalist provisions, and to integrate integrate how identity, need, and merit can fit together, not seeing them as conflicting. I just want to flash this up here. This is to corroborate the point I'm making that the program is very extensive and it's really false to think of it as only benefiting an elite and just totally omitting the masses. And I highlight in bold some of those that I think are more in the backdrop and I think kind of out of our minds when we think about the technical colleges, we think about microfinance, we think about public procurement, we think about Amanah Saham. I think, you know, we should grow in our acknowledgement of how extensive it is. And the decisive shortfall is not that there's lack of opportunity being dispersed. Because it's so extensive, it's so hard to remove. That's a fact. The lack of capability and competitiveness that is cultivated through that system to the Bumiputras is further, right? It exacerbates, it compounds the difficulty of, you know, making changes. Now, there's a lot of data that I can refer to about this problem to gain some kind of a grip on what is the situation about the distribution, right? But income distribution, you know, is the overarching, gives us an overarching view. And so I'm again contending against the view that NEP widens inequality, which is associated with that premise that, oh, it only benefits the elite and it doesn't benefit the poor. What does income inequality, what do income inequality trends show? Now, I was referring just now back to the 1990s, and I think that's where this view became quite planted in a lot of the public consciousness about rising inequality, because you had all those developments that I was talking about with privatization and so on. And it was also substantiated by the data. This is the household income survey computing the Gini coefficient. All you need to know is that a higher number means higher inequality. So 1990s, rising inequality. What has happened in the last 15 years or so? Declining inequality according to the most authoritative data that we have. And it has declined most of all within the Bumiputra population. And the current level is the lowest within the Bumiputra population. So don't take that from me, take that from the most authoritative source, the one that we have referred to in the past to say inequality has rising. That same source shows inequality has declining. And the NEP has there's so many elements involved in it. I think we need to be cautious when we make, you know, when we attribute one outcome like inequality to this thing called the NEP. There are programs that can have effects that increase inequality, some that reduce inequality. What this says to me is that overall, the many programs that have an effect on reducing inequality are dominating. They outweigh those that have effect on rising inequality. And that's related to kinds of things like expanding higher education, right? Which reduces the earnings premium on holding a degree or higher education qualifications. So that's, I think we have to have a clearer picture about what is the current situation, what are also the yearnings about society. And so this is where I present and have formulated something, you know, a framework, how we can build on the NEP. I think if we go about it by just, again, being confrontational and only be pro or anti or want to terminate NEP, then it's a non-starter because it disengages people from a conversation. And I think there is a lot of the strength that we can build on, again, because of it distinguish the two prongs. But to broaden that and not to focus on, and to focus on what are some enduring principles that can continue to be priorities that continue to be the overarching framework, even while we can make adjustments. So equality would correspond with the first prong, where the purpose is focused on well-being, dignity, and basic rights, right? And that's where the universalist policies can be parked. Now, these two are not mutually exclusive. They are interrelated, and that can be clarified. But the fairness principle is related more, that will be overseeing more the programs that promote participation, capability related to the second prong. And here we don't need to also get entangled in, getting rid of race-based policies and so on, and recognize that as Malaysia becomes a little bit more advanced and sophisticated, we're going to need to find balances of identity, of need and merit, both based for Bumiputra, right? For other disadvantaged groups based on gender as well. And that can translate into some more practical policy areas. Again, on the left side, the equality column, looking at welfare, paying attention to dignity. The equality principle can actually come in a very real and concrete way, because things like minimum wage, equal pay for equal work, right? Let me just touch on one more thing, because I think the NEP's first prong about poverty eradication, irrespective of race, it had a double role. It had the role of also assuring Malaysians of all groups that you're taken care of, especially the minorities. I think it's just woefully inadequate to still rely on that as the assurance given to all Malaysians that they're taken care of. I think a statement, that kind of assurance needs to be grounded in something that is much richer and much broader, this equality principle. And then on the other side, it's, I think, just unpacking a little bit more what I've already been saying about the focus areas, tertiary education, high-level occupations. There we need to integrate need, merit, and identity, and focus on the sector-specific targets and devise some timelines. Some examples there, I think, is really much more to reinforce. And I think probably since this is the main point that I want to leave with you, I probably can stop here, although there's a bit more that I can say that maybe can be taken up in the Q&A later. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. That's good. It's, I would say, a very good analysis, although it's a little bit, I would say, analytical enough for policy formulation. I think there is a lot of material that we can make use of it in order to make it more workable, as we see that there are certain shortcomings in the way things have gone in the NEP implementation. There is only one other point. I think this will be taken up earlier, because online there are some comments coming from your share screen and some of the slides that you have shared. I will take it up much later. So we'll straight away move on to, it's almost 1 hour past since we started. So we will try to get Professor Dato Rajah Rasiah to give us the views, and then we go on to the final speaker.
Thank you, Dato Sri Mohamed Iqbal. Thank you to Tan Sri Michael Yeo too, as well as Caroline, for inviting me to give my take on the topic today. I was fortunate to listen to 3 eminent speakers before me, Tan Sri Muhammad Sharif, Dato Sri Nazir Razak, Dr. Hwok-Aun. I'll be listening to Dr. Janice from now. I think my own take is I think we tend to equate whatever that happened or is going to happen with whatever in the background is NEP. I don't want to do that in that sort of sense, except that I would like to emphasize 2 key points which I think is necessary in the context of putting in there some things that either somewhat weren't addressed so much, although Dr. Lee Hwok-Aun actually did mention some aspects of it in that sort of sense, rather than get into this interesting discourse that we already heard from the other eminent speakers. The first point is, I was 12 years old in 1970, and I come from a poor background that I had no connections apart from knowing that my prime minister formally appointed in 1970 is Tun Abdul Razak. Yes, that of course he became Tun after he left. And the impressions I have producing the book that Dr. Sri Nazir mentioned because I spent a lot of time, even though it's an edited book, so very passionately done, I began to feel very strongly that we should have had Tun Razak much longer. He had just left too soon. And I will say why. Now, the first prong is not an issue, alleviation of poverty, regardless of ethnicity. It's not an issue at all, because it really went to the heart of a serious problem which all developing countries face. The second one, I began to realize that and some of the points that was articulated by Dato Sri Nazir is really important to understand. The circumstances in which the country became independent, the kind of truncated development that was taking, there was very little interaction. Even though I myself at 12, in the village that I was growing in the Malay village, I mean, I can speak Malay like most Malays. Now, in that sort of an environment, we were just running in shorts and nothing else, no slippers, nothing. And there's no distinction between ethnicity. I didn't see it at that time. And I also did not see it in the class. I had eventually gone to the first class, but nobody actually spoke about any element of ethnic polarization then. Now, I began to accept, not in school, but began to accept subsequently two key elements that justified the second one. The restructuring both horizontally and vertically of society that meant not just by economic functions, but by occupational rungs, because most of the professional side, and this is the interview which Tan Sri Kamal eventually, when he had the opportunity to speak to U.S. Parliament as well when the policy was implemented, a bit older than me, my mentor. Now that also meant that professionals were seriously polarized by non-Malays at that time. So it became unpalatable at that time to have an affirmative policy that I would have loved the way I grew up in school, because I didn't see any elements of ethnic polarization in my school. I studied in Holy Methodist School, which didn't have this problem of being focused on just one ethnic group. So for those reasons, I thought that was inevitable. That was inevitable, that we needed to have it along those lines. But I think that, I'm not sure if Sharif and my formal interpretation of things are different. The Industrial Coordination Act of 1975, paid up capital was the basis of registration of companies. Now that was raised, not lifted, when Daim became the finance minister. It was raised, it was not lifted. Now that was seen. In fact, if you look at the work of many others, David Lim, all sorts of others who have written about it, mentioned that was a constraining factor. But my own feeling is in this entire thing during Tun Razak's time, and it was not institutionalized, something important that took place there. Because we estimated in that book, productivity changes and so on. Even though we did not have explicit rocket science type of science parks, universities and so on at that time, we relied extensively on imported technologies, but we adapted. For example, double cropping from International Rice Research Institute of paddy. We managed to get self-sufficiency at 87% in 1975. Tun Razak was still prime minister then. Now it's less than 70% now. Now, I then, in the process of doing this book, began to understand, although it was not institutionalized frequently, is the fact that he wanted change whenever things didn't work out. There were examples where things were not improving, he wanted change. That sort of element I didn't see subsequently. Now that should have been institutionalized, because if you look at how the Koreans visited Pelda before they launched the Semal Undang, Park Chung-hee launched it in 1972 in Busan. It was one that adapted it to show that sort of a roadmap that included stringent standards to be met. If it weren't met, the custodian, the captains of that sort of plan was removed. He wanted change. Firms that enjoyed subsidies, firms that had incentives, grants, they had to perform. And if they abused it, they even went to jail. You can look at Ali Sampson's book, South Korea and Late Industrialization, the Asia's Next Giant. Now, we didn't have any of those things. That goes to somewhat support the point that my former colleague, Dr. Hwok-Aun mentioned, that there was no attempt to build capabilities. And the building of capabilities, of course, required that sort of screening is important, because when you're starting from a low base, trial and error is the method that you get up. That's the Confucian saying. When you cross the stream, you have to really see where the shallow parts are. Through trial and error, you get the other side. Now, there must be very forceful ways to stop that sort of dissipation, which I think happened extensively. Now, my own feeling, and this is again from the interviews, Tun Razak didn't want to have this policy go beyond 1990. Now, the policy was often, to me, used as an excuse rather than the blame for why the country didn't develop, for those who are critics of the policy. And that policy became a convenient excuse for those who wanted to use it to pursue certain goals. The sort of point that Dr. Nazir mentioned about money politics just now, the abuse of rents and so on. It's my own feeling is the accumulation and evolution of capabilities didn't coincide with the kind of developments taking place in Korea in time. Both countries were poorer than Malaysia by per capita income. Even in the 70s, they were poorer than Malaysia. We did definitely better than the rest of the East Asian countries, except for Japan and China. China still with a lower per capita income, but the gradient of growth is such that it's a matter of time. Despite having 1.4 billion people, China is growing beyond us, and we don't actually have any industrial firm at the frontier, like a Samsung or a TSMC. We don't have that sort of example to show something that Kunio Yoshihara claims in his book. It's because of the reluctance of the entrepreneurs to invest deeply, fearing that the state may intervene in the type of regime we had in Indonesia when Suharto was in power. So my feeling that was the problem. The second problem I thought was, I like this very much, not just because I was a district champion or thing in Malay, but this claim being made that we should have kept English. It's not a claim that resonates very well with people with serious thinking, because Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and China, their basic language, science evolved not in English. They've all gone to the front, they have frontier firms. Huawei is a frontier firm. Now, that cannot be the reason. In that sense, we could have taken the path Indonesia took. And I remember still the Westphalian state created from 1648 or the French Revolution from 1757. These are all important elements that build nation states, that build one polity, which we didn't have. So my own feeling is, for those reasons, I would very much support, and this is actually in the shared prosperity vision blueprint of ours, the needs-based approach. Why should we see ourselves evolving truncatedly as 3 different ethnic groups, or wider still with more other ethnic groups? I don't think that that's going to help us evolve as a nation state in the way the Rukun Negara recommended. Although the Rukun Negara is similar in some sense to the Pancasila, which comes from the Dasasila, it doesn't have royalty there as far as Pancasila is concerned. So those are important points to me, that we lost the chance to evolve our companies technologically to be able to compete, which is an important element because that leads to value added. If we are stuck in the middle income trap, that's because we haven't had this engine to ensure that our value added continues to grow. Korea's per capita income now is over 3 times that of Malaysia, with a population of 50 against our 32 million. Now, these are things that were systematically done, and there are examples for it. And my own feeling is we should have used the expression, the cat can look at the king, and looked at it where things didn't happen, what we should have done to overcome them. I'm actually quite positive, still confident that we could achieve that sort of growth. In other words, from the premature deindustrialization we're witnessing now, we can actually reindustrialize and achieve that. But one area where I feel I don't know where we are going with regards to the kind of politics we have. I don't think that we have a sense of a cabinet or sense of MPs that give me much confidence that we are actually moving towards one polity as a nation state, the way Rukun Negara would have expected us to do. I don't think that's happening. And I'm not very much confident on that. So but remember that certain things happened during Tun Razak's time, one of which is rural development. A lot of achievements were done. Much of the reduction in poverty happened because of all these explicit parastatals that were created. In that period, at least until Tun Razak left, there were attempts, although it wasn't institutionalized. But I say it's not institutionalized. Look at the example since. From 1989 since, we faced a current account deficit, a growing current account deficit on food. from 1989. Just go and check. In fact, we import most of our chilies, even our chili we mostly import. That sort of intensive farming and so on, which really relates very much to the Bumi Putra, didn't really happen. And nothing much is happening. In fact, I'm trying to get back into it by looking at how digitalization and Industry 4.0 can help revive these things. And the second one is we had EOI from 1970, effectively NEP was starting in 1970, officially launched the second Malaysia plan. But therein, we did not have the sort of leveraging strategy Singapore had or Ireland had that ensured that certain things were met so that we were growing rapidly, we were benefiting at the same time, apart from simply creating jobs, low value added jobs, simply having investments here and starting to export when most of the foreign exchange generated went back abroad. In fact, many senior police, civil servants in MEP even say that this is not so much those who are promoting FDI, they are actually saying that, have we really seriously benefited? One could also talk to Dr. Nungsari about this. That sort of enabling things to create national capabilities was somewhat missing. I will come back to that later. I would like to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajah. I think you are sharing with us your expertise that you have seen in other nations and how they have prospered while we are still talking about our own decline and how we can get back on track. And one aspect of it is the NEP has been to some extent contributing to this decline. And definitely we will see how best we would be able to get back into that industrial formulation that you are talking about. Finally, we now look at Dr. Janice Nga. Sorry that I didn't give you the preference as a lady, but you will have the more impactful last speaker so that you can wrap up everybody what they have said, and then what they have not said, you'll be in a position to bring it up the best with you. And earlier I have already said that she is Associate Professor Planning and Development Economics, Faculty of Business Economics and Accountancy, University of Malaysia, Sabah. I re-emphasize the word Sabah because earlier I made a little gaffe. You come from University of Leeds, where you did your PhD plus. It's very different kind of accreditation. Congratulations to you. And then we invite you now to give your presentation. Dr. Nga?
Thank you, Dato Sri, moderator, for the introduction. And I must record my appreciation and thanks to the organizer to invite me to share my humble views on this platform. Right, NEP, and the good thing is being the final panelist, you have listened to all, so you have less to say, supposedly. Right, so NEP, New Economic Policy, as mentioned earlier on, always invite these questions like whether it's success or failure, right or wrong, that kind of measurement. Officially, as it is, NEP should end at 1971, 1990. So when it was introduced, I was not born yet. I was -4 years old. Yeah, but it seems like when it's supposed to be officially end in 1990, it continues on the characteristic in a different policy. For instance, like national development policy, and also continue with the vision policy and so on and so forth. So to some extent, NEP also, if you like to say, it can be like a never-ending policy to some extent. Yeah, NEP, never-ending policy. But again, another question: is it right or wrong that people like to question? Yeah, because it's not without criticism. People will say this is a race-based policy, and whenever it's race-based, then it's supposed to be not good. Now, if we look at the time when NEP was introduced, during that time, okay, it happened to be the Malay is in that segment of society, the poorest. So when we have the policy to address in such a way, it is not wrong, actually. So for today's, for example, if we have people in the difficulties, like under COVID, you see, we have people raising the white flag and things like that, we will just give, yeah. For instance, like another case, like youth or women's these days having issues, and we give them more, you know, helps and all this. So that is supposed to be no issue, because we have that kind of a concern or moral obligation to some extent. Yeah, if that can be appreciated. So over time, the poorest are no longer solely belongs to Malay as well. So the identity, economic activities, identity to the ethnic groups is, to some extent, is no longer there. We have great achievement through this NEP to some extent, that we have middle class Malay and so on and so forth. Okay, we have also rich Malay and yeah. So over time, the poorest are no longer also solely belongs to Malay. So the identity of poor is also no longer a race base. So this is, I think, if I can put it, summarize in that. Now, listening to all the distinguished panelists earlier on, so some of the points have been covered. So I think I will take on those issues or things that is yet to be discussed, okay, or further discussed, okay. Now we have these issues on equity and equality. So I think way forward, we should look into this rather equity instead of equality, because for the poor, in fact, the poor Malay, for example, they may not during that time benefit the most, okay? No doubt they benefit, okay? So you can see all the poverty line, you know, poverty have been eradicated to some extent and so on. But talking about this equality, we may not even what is not needed to the targeted group, okay? So I think equity is more suitable in the way forward, okay? Another important points that I think when we talk about NEP, like rights, okay, the issue of special rights. Well, to be honest, none of the non-Bumi, okay, myself included, have ever questioned on this special right of the Bumiputra or the Malay, okay? Now the questions arise when there is some changes in the emphasis of this special right. It becomes supremacy, okay, or Ketuanan Melayu, okay? Special rights actually is already exists during the colonial time. For example, in the education during the colonial time, there is a scholarship. So one scholarship is specially devoted for the Bumiputra only, or the Malay only. And then another one is open for all. So that is a Queen Scholarship. Okay, so I happened to discover this in the colonial report when I was doing my PhD, so just a sharing. But the difference is, as compared to today's scholarship, is the qualification, okay, to meet the minimum qualification in order to get that scholarship is maintained. So meaning to say, if there is no applicant candidates that meet the standard of that scholarship of that year, then it have to be vacant for that year. Now, as compared to today's scholarship, for example, it's quite different. Okay, it's like a quota. You have to fill out. Okay, we have allocate 50, so therefore must be 50 to be, you know, that kind of thing. So there is a differences. Okay, so we have a very successful scholar as well. Okay, from that benefit from that Queen's Scholarship. Okay, so I just want to point out the differences. So when we talk about supremacy, okay, first, nobody questioned on the special right, and it is protected under the Constitution, okay. But when it comes to this supremacy, Malay supremacy, or even Malay Islam supremacy, okay, then that is something quite different. Then it binds to another big words, okay? Social contract, for instance, whether this social contract exists or not exists, okay? So if I could quote what the late Royal Professor Unku Aziz, okay, in 2008, that is the first time that we mentioned, actually there is no social contract, okay? And of course, our former Prime Minister Tun Mahathir disagree with that and saying that there is a social contract. And in his word, it's like this social contract, although it's not written, but it is understanding, social understanding. So you can judge for yourself whether there is a social contract or there is no contract at all, okay? So talking about the, we have a long list of achievement of NEP, for example, from 2.4%. I think that the Sri Nazir mentioned that we achieved 19% and stuck it there. We did not achieve 30%. One very important question is from 2.4%, yes, we increased, okay, we have some achievement there. But why then we stuck at 19% and not even after the 1990s and so on, it did not go further, okay? So whether is there an issue within this NEP? Is this the MEP that stopped or made that kind of, you know, limitations to that achievement? Okay, so that may be, we have to think about it for the way forward, okay, so to review our NEP or NEP elements in a different policy, RMK and so on, Malaysia plan and so on, okay. And then I would like to say also, Malaysia, okay, the corruptions, of course, you know better, and everybody know about the corruption in Malaysia. Now, during this era of NEP, unfortunately, to some extent, this corruption is where it's blossomed, okay? From when we started to tolerate this kind of corruption or abuse of power, and with lots of justifications, so on, we take it as a norms in our daily life. So again, this is something that we need to look into way forward. Unity, this is a great issue, Dr. Sri and all the viewers. We have these unity problems, and I think sometimes we talk about NEP, but we forgot about this Rukun Negara or the national principles that is also declared in, I think the National Day, 31st August 1970, okay? And I just would like to read out the first line, not the bottom principle that we always memorize. And it says, whereby our country, Malaysia, nurtures the ambitious, achieving and fostering better unity amongst the society. So I could believe 1 year later, when they have this NEP, the ultimate goal is unity. But as what Dr. Sri Nazir put it earlier on, there are lots of such side effects, and unity is something that really an issue. We have this brain drain. Now, what happened to this brain drain? Are these Malaysian? They don't love Malaysia and they choose to stay overseas. Nobody wants to leave their homeland if they have a choice. But of course, when they choose and compare benefit and the cost or whatever, and what future holds for them in Malaysia, they may have made a very difficult decision to stay overseas. And that is brain drain. Imagine we invest in our human resource from baby, we invest until they graduated. There you go. They stay in UK, they in Singapore, they in all other countries, but not servicing our Malaysian country. So these are the things that I think we need to look at that. What else? There are many things that I would like to say, but it's just that time limit. But to put it in a nutshell, how we reset, how we try to achieve all these things. I think it comes back to the very basics, our moral, okay, our sincerity, or the word Ikhlas in Malay, okay, our love to other people. We see each other as family. Now, I think it will blend well with our Keluarga Malaysia concept under the new Prime Minister, and hopefully it works better for Malaysia and also all Malaysians, okay? I would like to, again, challenge myself, challenge my student and everyone, that can we have this concept, okay, that to reset, when we do some overhaul or whatever on the policy, okay, can we say this? Anything good for Malaysia is good for me, and therefore I will commit and fulfill it. So if we look at the poor and those poor and needy, and we say anything good for the poor and needy, then it's good for me. Then we are happily, share what we have. Okay, I'm a Christian, so we say to give is more blessed than to receive. So do we really practice this kind of practice in our daily life? So I think if everybody see each other as a family member, have that kind of love, have that kind of concern and transparency, okay, I think there wouldn't be a big issue. Okay, so in terms of other matters, I think another one is transparency is very important. On the data, for example, data of wealth, okay, we may have income data, but how about the wealth data? Okay, sometimes we do not know how rich were our politicians or ministers and things like that. So I think to move forward, to bring Malaysia for a greater heights, okay, we need to look into all these things. Do we still have hope with all these unity problems? But I think COVID brings us some different perspective. Dr. Sri, if you may allow me for the last point. When we see COVID-19 come to Malaysia, and it solves several problems also, although it gives lots of issues. Okay, when citizen or civil society start taking care of each other, okay, we are united. We are no longer differentiated by the 3R, by the colors, the race, religion, or region. But do we really need to have continuous pandemic or another disaster to keep us united? I would say it is not too clever if we want to think that, right? So that we can only stay united in the bad days, but good days we can't stay united. So can we choose to be united Malaysia even in good days? Maybe that is part of the human nature, just like some people, when they are good times, good health or whatever, very often they forgot about God. But when they are having issues with their health or problems, disaster, then they start remember God and can pray to God and things like that. So anyway, but God is always good all the time, and all the time God is good, is always there. So the choice is actually us, whether we want to choose to be united. As a Chinese, for example, okay, I don't like to refer myself as a Chinese, but when you landed in KIA in Malaysia, then you start to become Chinese. If you were overseas, then you are Malaysians, okay? All right. Very often we heard that we are second-class citizens, and that happened to me as well. And I even tell my friends, my families, and all these things. Everyone can treat you second-class citizen, but if you treat yourself second-class citizen, then you are second-class. So I, maybe through girl guiding, because we have a training, we love the country and so much and so on, I always treat myself first class. I don't care about whatever policy and all these things that give you limitations and all these things. We choose to be first class citizen. Therefore, we are the first class Malaysian citizens. So I'm happy to be Malaysia, and I hope and I pray always for our country. So to love Malaysia is to know Malaysia is to love Malaysia, and to love Malaysia is to pray for Malaysia. So I urge everybody to pray for our country, for a united Malaysia, for a united leaders. Okay, don't play racist cards, religion cards, region or whatever, but stay united. Then only we can be more developed in years to come and have a better Malaysia for our generations to come. Thank you, I think, Dr. Sri.
Thank you, Dr. Janice. Thank you for ending with a great hope and a prayer, if I may say. Yes, thank you very much, all panelists, for your very good remarks and viewpoints. Now, before actually we open this up for questions that have come online as well as earlier to the Secretariat, there is one thing that seems to be overarching in this discussion is that you brought out very well the issues relating to the policy, the two-pronged policy of the NEP. At the same time, there were a lot related to the problems of the country, the nation as a whole. Now, whether all the problems that we have outlined and not outlined are actually the consequence of the implementation of the NEP, or they are totally unrelated. There must be some nexus, that's for sure. But on the economic front, 1970, 1969, 1970, leading to the 1971, it was the political circumstances and ramifications that gave rise to the incident. And if the politics is not right, we will have, I'm sorry to use the word, like a disaster-like situation is what happened in 69. And we do not want, nobody in Malaysia, including the politicians, want a thing of that sort to happen. Now, after 1990, with what we have seen as the country's progress, and that has been very clearly articulated by Tan Sri Sharif Kassim, and we saw also Dato Dr. Rasiah, Rajah, giving us a perspective of how other countries, particularly South Korea, has overtaken us. These are nuances for us. And Dato Sri Nazir Razak brought out the good aspects of the policy and also the shortcomings of the policy and how we would be able to bridge whatever that we are looking forward. The first question that I would like to ask the panelists, not specific to anyone, is whether the politics of the day and what we see is likely to happen in the years to come, 2022 or 2023, when the next election is due, maybe 2022 or 2023, is likely to give rise to a continuation in whatever form, minus all the shortfalls of a policy that is not race-based, but need-based, as what Dr. Lee brought up, the clarity on the issue, and driven by the need for the country to uplift itself from the decline. We need a point of inflection. I think this is the essence of the argument. Anybody to take what it is going to be the politics, because politics determine to a large extent the policies and their implementation, taking note of all the ramifications of the implementations and its shortcomings. Anybody to comment?
You want me to comment?
No, you're most welcome, Tan Sri.
Thank you very much. Yeah, the past is the past, but what I am encouraged to see now happening is the MOU, which was recently signed between the government and the opposition, where they have agreed on a set of reforms. I believe that if the Prime Minister gives his full support to this and if the reforms come through, much of the issues that we have been talking about, will be dealt with in a satisfactory manner. For example, if you have these parliamentary reforms, which civil society has been
craving
for many years now, looks like it is coming through. Now, if it comes through and if Parliament sets up to select parliamentary committees to monitor, to become the watchdog, then many of the abuses, the corruption, the cronyism, can be put in check. I think I have a feeling that Malaysians, most of the criticisms about the NEP is not so much about the policy, but the way it is implemented and the abuses that happened after the NEP. So if these new reforms, which hopefully will be implemented under the MOU, if these reforms can introduce more checks and balances, there will be less corruption, there will be less abuses, less wastage of funds. Because basically, I think all Malaysians agree that there is a need to reduce disparities in the country. Whether you call it the NEP, whether you call it vision, shared vision, there is a need to reduce disparities, including disparities between Peninsular Malaysia, East Malaysia. That's another set of disparities which need to be looked into. But a lot depends on the politicians being honest, open, and transparent in their policies.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you, Tan Sri, for that view. Politics, as I said earlier, politics determine economics and the rest, social structure, social engineering, whatever it is. Now, knowing the circumstances under which this memorandum, which you brought it up, is signed, and to me, it doesn't look like a long-term understanding because we do not know who is going to be the government in the next round, whether the election is going to come in 2022 or 2023. Now, looking at the sort of structures, the political differences and fractured oppositions and so on, Dr. Nazir, what is your own view? I mean, you have come from a background of politics, but you're not in politics, I know that. father, very illuminary in politics and did a lot of things, and then brother also did, but some things went wrong and things like that. Where does the political future of the country is going for the tweaking of the policy, whether it is the NEP in its new name or shared prosperity vision or whatever you call it, is going to be, and less race-based kind of a thing? What is the scenario?
Thank you. I think firstly on your reflection about the NEP and its contribution to politics today, I think it's very important to also acknowledge that through the years we had the NEP, but it was not the only policy around. If you look at the 80s, for instance, we had Malaysia Inc. Mark I, which is the early days of the Mahathir Musa administration. Then we had what I call Malaysia Inc. Mark II, which is after the mid-80s recession, with Tundaim, privatization, and this series of anointed Bumi Putra tycoons, and that model of accelerated growth and kind of Bumi Putra ecosystems, which completely crashed in the Asian financial crisis. And of course, along the way, you had the various incidences where we saw the deterioration in our institutions. Yeah, so certainly one can't attribute that much about today's politics to the new economic policy. In terms of the recent development of the MOU, I agree with Nazir Sharif. I'm extremely positive. It doesn't really matter why this has happened. What is important is that these reforms actually take place, because these are very, very solid reforms, and that's democracy. It's given rise to this pragmatism that in order for the Prime Minister to perpetuate his Prime Ministership, he has to give in to these series of reforms, and I think they're very, very good. Personally, I hope that these reforms are just the beginning, because I don't believe that this is enough in order to fix the country, in order to get to a better Malaysia. Because I happen to think that the troubles within the system are far deeper than those that are going to be dealt with this series of reforms. Only 18, and you've got parliamentary select committees, etc. Yes, good, but more needs to be done. And in particular, I would say that one needs to look at the electoral reforms, because I do think that given our plural society, we do need some form of proportional representation. And also, I do think we need to rebalance institutions to make sure that they check each other. And also, one of the big things that I think we should have is really to take out SPRM as well as the Election Commission from the Prime Minister's office to another institution. Yeah, so that we can have political competition that is properly refereed. And I could go on, but the big point is I do think a lot more reforms are needed than what is in the MOU. But I'm very, very supportive of this MOU.
Good, that will be a hope. If there is no strong government, whether by an understanding between the different government and the opposition, or even a singular coalition which is strong enough, you cannot bring any sort of economic reforms and take off in terms of implementation. So we need a strong government, and a good start has been made under this MOU. And you also mentioned about the new economic model that was discussed under the Economic Action Council and put it into some sort of a framework, but did not go or take a boost. Taking that cue, Professor Rajah, you also looked at the difficulty of anything that is moving forward to imitate the success of other countries. You mentioned about Singapore, although our politicians and our ministers do not like to compare ourselves to Singapore. Sorry, Dr. Lee. So how can we reactivate the sort of a good thinking that was in the new economic model and how we can sort of put a boost up to achieve better economic performance in the years to come, taking into consideration the 4IR, IR4, digitalization, and 5G, and what have you in the technology frontier.
Thank you, Dato Sri. I generally agree with the point Tan Sri Sharif raised just now, as well as Dato Sri Nazir. But I'm not as bullish as Tan Sri Sharif, though, about how this arrangement could lead to that. So let me just point out why I say that. There is this notion, a dichotomy between the state and the market. When you take that sort of a position, the market is just one institution, which is basically guided by relative prices. Now, if you are looking at institutional reform, yes, and you have a whole range of them. If you look at those Nobel laureates who articulated the concept of institutions, it can even be informal, formal, legislation, guidance. Why? Because economic goods are very different. We can't be talking about manufacturing, say, aircraft if we are not going to have scale, or automobiles, Proton, for example. So you have normal goods, we have public goods, which are non-excludable and non-rivalrous, like knowledge, the environment, and so on. We have inferior goods, like rice. We have all sorts of goods. They all require different kinds of governance. Now, my feeling is that much of this debate I see about we need reform, they all tend to just point to the market. I think this notion that FDI and market by themselves can solve all these problems is a panacea. I don't think in reality that's how it is worked. I'm Korea and Taiwan. I have actually had on the ground work experience doing for the World Bank, UNIDO, and so on in 45 countries, not just Korea, Taiwan, and so on. In my own understanding, taking that point, I think that we need to have clear roadmaps with clear notion, knowing that catching up process, or even we are talking about leapfrogging to lead certain industries, which are things that Tun Mahathir planned, though, even though he didn't manage to achieve any of those things in 1981 when he became prime minister for the first time with the Look East policy. But my own feeling is we did not have that sort of reviews, recalibration as new information came in. A whole lot of things are random and they all differ because we are using this process of catching up and going up. And in the process, creating those other intermediary organizations that we require, which help solve collective action problems, and they too should be subjected to reviews. Now, I just give one example before passing the cue to the others. Let's look at how Taiwan, using the ITRIs, Industrial Technical Research Institutes, promoted with a state policy until 2000. After that, there's no more state policy for it. By then, they had brought up TSMC as the world's leading logic chips firm. UMC, among those firms that could do whatever others can, because its objective was not to overtake any other firms, and a whole range of other industries. They had people with tacit knowledge. We have Malaysians with tacit knowledge, but they're not the ones who ran MIMOS and so on. They had studied in the best of universities. They have worked in the best of firms. Maurice Chang, for example, was senior vice president of Texas Instruments, in charge of R&D. He was connected to the public R&D labs. He was connected to buyers and suppliers. They were key in how those firms were launched and how they were made to become world's best. Now, my own feeling is we have Malaysians. And just now, our Dr. Janice talked about many having gone away. I mean, there are 50% of our engineers in Singapore are actually Malaysians. Why are they there? I mean, it's not that they'd love to be there. I mean, a lot of them come to Malaysia during holidays. The R&D director of TSMC is from Ipoh. The guy who launched this microchip turned a $900,000 US firm to $1 billion firm, Hwok-Aun is a Malaysian. But that's a classic example where he applied for an incubator to do it in Malaysia. He was rejected. Now, I'm making all these cases, Diana. These are people whom I met on the ground. I even took the Khazanah Fellows when I was senior advisor at that time, but I quit doing that job subsequently because I wasn't delivering anything. But my own feeling is the potential is there, it can be done. The political will must be there, but although my friend Tan Sri Sharif is somewhat bullish, I hope they are there to support this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. just rhetoric alone is not going to bring in the FDIs and also the industry players into the country. Dr. Lee, I just wanted to take up this point. One of the charts that you showed, the distribution of the Gini coefficient according to the races, the Malays, Chinese, and the Indians. Am I correct by saying that in every case there was a deterioration? And if so, how would the measures be instituted? You talked about need-based and also market-oriented. Yes, that is good. How would this be corrected, so to speak, in the looking forward, particularly in the shared prosperity vision that the government has announced, and probably there is going to be a meaty part in the 12th Malaysia Plan?
Thank you very much, Dato Sri. Thank you for raising this, because I think I do need to clarify, and I know I rushed it a little bit just now, so this is a good opportunity to restate that, and also to just to clear the air on this inequality. So it's an indicator that I showed. I think you can probably just visualize it's going down, went up in the 90s, and then flattened a little bit. Declining meaning, as you said, deterioration. It's a decline in inequality. So actually, it's getting less unequal. That is across the board within all communities, and as well as within Bumiputra, and it is the steepest within Bumiputra, and the level of inequality is the lowest. Now, I'm not saying that this is all wonderful, that we stop there. I think it is showing that there have been changes in the direction of expanding middle class, right? My main point was that that we need to dispense with the premise that the NEP is only about elite enrichment and that it doesn't benefit the masses, because that declining inequality trend, it confounds this perception. Inequality is still a problem, right? Elite enrichment and taking unfairly gaining the system and gaming for the system remains a problem, but I don't think that's the defining problem. And here I want to jump in a little bit into the fray of the NEM. Bursting the bubble a little bit here, because I think the NEM really dropped the ball on affirmative action. It was very muddled. It was jumping around from issue of, so let me go back when I say the NEP was clear about the two prongs. It also meant that if you want poverty reduction, you implement poverty reduction policies. If you want social restructuring of diversification in all these various areas and entrepreneurship and upward mobility, you need social restructuring policies. There is, with the NEM and a very bipartisan consensus even, and society-wide consensus about this, that is confused about that distinction. Basically what the mindset now is that we can do social restructuring, but we use poverty alleviation instruments. And we've forgotten about the difference between the two. And I think the NEM, by not showing any recognition at all about the existence even of MARA programs, of microfinance, of the technical colleges, it was so far removed from the reality also that, and this is still been quite absent even from our discussion, you look at survey after survey about the sentiments on the ground, a vast majority of Malays support this system. And they are not supporting it because of the vested interests of the politicians, as I think often is we like to think of it that way. They support it, I would argue, because it is extensive, because they actually receive the benefits. And I think that has to be an important starting point, because it will be disruptive if we suddenly just say, let's stop race-based and replace it with something else, or you don't clarify what it is, and then you make people very nervous, because it's just something that is they can project their fears because you haven't even explained to them what this need-based is. I want to clarify that where I'm saying, and basically the essence of what I'm proposing is we've got to come back to the clarity of provisions that are universal, that can deliver on the basis of equality. And we talk about COVID-19. I think this is a great moment in history to emphasize that, because we can see it shouldn't be just about helping the poor regardless of race. It needs to be about social protection, about the healthcare system. What's for not just the B40, but also the M40. What about wages, minimum wage, fair wages, and a whole range of things that can subscribe to the enduring principle of equality. And that also gets us away from just this endless, very polarized, and I think stalemated and forever will never be resolved when we only are in conflict about keep the NEP or end it. That kind of debate is just, to me, a non-starter. If you want to think of the box, I say we need to move away from that to settle on what are enduring principles that can be within which we have flexibility to make all kinds of adjustments. And then the second one is on the principle of fairness, and that's where we park the whole range of programs that are related to participation, related to promoting achievement, where you cannot just help the poor and expect the kind of results that you want in terms of having a dynamic entrepreneurial class. If we want to remove away from race-based, and I'm seeing a lot of the comments there, and I think this is a yearning, and it widely resonates. I think it's unhelpful, and I think it's conceptually a bit misguided, and politically it's also not going to fly to just say let's get rid of race-based, but we move towards identity, the broadening it. And as I was saying, I mean, Malaysian society has also advanced, has become a bit more sophisticated. I was mentioning that recent years we have programs that are promoting women, right, in directorships, in decision-making positions, in political representation. There are programs, I'm not just advertising them, I'm just mentioning them. They need to be critiqued as well, but for the Indian community, for Orang Asli. So how do we fit it all together? I think that's by broadening it, that to recognize that we still need to look at identity, but not be fixated on it, not let race dominate, but be mindful of identity while we're trying to find a way to balance also the need to select and provide opportunity to the capable based on merit and also based on need. And when I say sector by sector, I didn't really get to elaborate very much, but I think if we focus on a few, it hopefully will illustrate a bit better. So it has greater application when we talk about need. If need can be at the basis to provide opportunity, that means giving more opportunity to the poor, to the disadvantaged in higher education. That's where it is most applicable, right? Because children from disadvantaged families, we allow them a leg up to get into university. It logically makes sense, it's practically possible, it's morally grounded. But that's not something that is actionable when it comes to, if you want to develop SMEs or procurement for advanced kind of operating advanced companies. You can't be just throwing money at poor households and say, become the next game changer in business. If we want to do policies in that area to promote this Bumiputra Indian women entrepreneurs, it has to be based on merit, but it still has to be based on some kind of group targeted policy that is targeting Bumiputras or as the Indians and women and so on. So that kind of a mix, and not just just one size fits all and kind of sweeping and very polemical and overblown statements, I think is unhelpful. We need to dig down into the specifics and see that find that balance, right, on the principle of fairness, because equality would be overly binding. It's not something that truly can be. I think we need to be thinking of those of equal opportunity and balance that, right, with some of the other interests of diversity and representation.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that elaborate briefing. Now, looking at the NEP and its manifestations over the 50 years, I think this has been the discussion point. If you ask the question, the basic question, the Malay Bumiputra community, are they satisfied? The by and large Bumiputra Malay community, are they satisfied? Big question mark there. Then the next, the Chinese. If you ask them generally, if you go and do a survey or through whatever form, are they satisfied? You would find invariably that there is also a certain degree of discontent, but maybe it is lesser than the Malay community, because the Malay community still feels that they have been left behind, whether it is the B40 or the M40 or whatever the grouping that we have to look at it. Whether you look at the Indian and the Orang Asli groups and so on, they are also all the time clamoring for some participation, not only in education, but in economics, and then upward mobility in the society. If in the final analysis, the NEP has been successful in some areas, but broadly it has not been successful because there is certain degree of discontentment in every component part of the society. Now that is going to be a big issue. That is why we are now saying the reset will have to be looked at from all these discontentment points of view, and what would be the relevant kind of postulations for the future. But probably this is not the time for us to discuss this, because we are running to the end of the webinar or the roundtable. At this point, I would like to thank all of you for taking on the questions, but there are a few more questions. There is a range of questions that have been put forward online prior to this and some coming in. I have broadly categorized them into three areas. The first is looking at the past. I think all the panel speakers have been able to analyze this from their own individual understanding and experience and put forward. So I think it is pointless to go back to those questions and ask for a reiteration of that. So we will try to avoid that one. There are some suggestions that have come. For example, in the poverty eradication. Now, this is again a sort of explosive issue, because there is discontentment as to the statistics provided by the government as to what the poverty level and how much of it has been eradicated, and also by the World Bank and so on. And that is, we do not want to be drawn into that, but it is very apparent the poverty level is not as what it appears to be projected by the government. There is more vulnerability in the area, and the COVID pandemic has created more vulnerability into that area. So very specific. And then SMEs. How do you now take on the SMEs and the MSSMEs, and what sort of a help that can be given as need-based, as what has been said. Again, these are very specific and very difficult to discuss this. But there are one or two very pertinent questions that have been asked. For example, what can the forum do to stop the political intrusion in all our NEP delivery for the Rajah? In other words, there is the NEP and there is the delivery, but politics and politicians have intruded into that area and affecting the delivery into that one. Any takers on this? Again, it comes back to politics, as I said earlier.
Dato Sri, let me just make 2 points here. I generally take this view, and of course I share with you that politics leads all this. I think the politicians have hijacked the NEP. As I mentioned earlier, that my feeling is those who are, a lot of them who are condemning the NEP, they somehow equate everything that's happening around and that's happened around is because of NEP. And then those who suddenly need to do something, most of the time the politicians, they invoke the NEP to achieve such goals. My own feeling is, looking at the period from 1970 to 1976, and the extension Tun Hussein On added, which he didn't really transform very much, there were, to me, really good captains like Tun Ismail Ali. Tun Ismail Ali is one of them, or Tun Dr. Ismail. To me, in fact, I've written chapters on this for a book by a Cambridge professor, Malcolm Marshall. The way monetary policies were handled, the way he handled during the first oil crisis when oil prices went up 4 times, and we didn't have that much of oil that time, and the second oil crisis, 79, 80. My feeling is we need actors of that sort, and actors who are really competent and at the same time honest enough to execute things for the interest of the country. But if you leave it to the politicians to hijack it, this is the sort of consequence we will get. Thank you.
Okay. Another question that seems to be lurking in the participants' mind is, you have discussed this all very good. Points were taken, and then at the initial outset, Tan Sri Michael did talk about Majlis Perundingan Ekonomi, maybe 3.0 to be done. The question that is being asked is, what sort of framework or a task force that is necessary in order to implement this? Maybe we post this to Dato Sri Nazir.
Sorry, as I mentioned at the beginning, I just don't think you can just deal with the NEP. I think you need to deal holistically and how everything's intertwined. To your earlier question about political intervention, I said it before, we don't have an economy. We only have a political economy, right? The intrusion of politics into our economy has been almost total, right? If you're a businessman, you can't do very much without bumping into government, either through contracts, licenses, and equity rules and so on. So in order to do this, we should have a platform, a deliberative platform to debate the system as a whole. And I have looked at various new models of deliberative democracy, like the National Citizens Assembly of Ireland, as well as the Belgian in Belgium. And these are now very effective in dealing with long-term structural problems. And they complement parliamentary democracy in other countries. And ironically, Malaysia was the first to have one, which is our NCC in 1970. And I think we should have one now to look at not just the NEP, but the system holistically. And let me just, since we're getting to the end, just apologize for mentioning my late father here. But I think when I'm writing a book on him, and I've reflected that, one of the issues, unfortunate issues, is I think we've got his legacy wrong. When people ask about Tun Razak's legacy, we think of the NEP, we think of Petronas, we think of Bank Bumi, blah, 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 right? The tangible legacy. But what's more important, actually his methods, his values. And when I study them, he was pragmatic, he was methodical, and he was self-assured, very open to criticism. As Prof. Rajah said, he was very open to change things that were not going wrong. And today, I think long ago, he would have expected us to sit down and say that this system that he designed for our conditions in 1970 is no longer fit for purpose. He would want us to reform the NEP, right? We mustn't be stuck with the things he did. We must think of the approach of being pragmatic and in line with the demands of Malaysia and Malaysians today, and not just keep that's outdated.
Thank you, Dato Sri. There is one question which is not related to the NEP, but it is related to the racial discrimination. This NEP may be skewed to one race rather than to the multi-fabric society. This is the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination.
ISEAS.
ISEAS, yes. I think it doesn't fit into our context. ISEAS is a maybe I just want to ask Dr. Janice Nga to make any view on this quickly.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sri. Before I make on the ISET, maybe I would like to say a little bit on the government. As mentioned, a strong government that you can do amendment and all these things, but there is a catch that it also can be abusive and manipulative. So I would rather prefer to have mature politician rather than a strong government. We can have a minority government, but if the politicians are mature enough, and if the policy is good and the politicians ask themselves whether this is good policy for the people and therefore it's good for me, I think that is no problem in any case. Okay. And for the ISEP, I think to some extent, yes, it may relate to this NEP implementation, especially when it touched on the rights. Yeah. I think during the Pakatan Harapan's government, they have tried to sign this ISET, but unfortunately, it gets, I think, some politicians. So in Malaysia, basically everything is politics, okay, social, economy, or whatever, is all politics. So the narrative being used or propaganda being used, especially led by UMNO, led the Malay Islam politicians, has kind of paint this as something like, okay, if you sign the ISET, therefore you go on your special rights and privileges and benefits. So I think this kind of misleading information is sinful. Okay, if in Malay we say menabur dakwah, dakwah, preaching, and the menabur dakwah. This is a kind of information spread for the purpose of certain intentions. Yeah. So I think it's very clear, because not only ISEP, because that after that in the future, it seems to say that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights also will be signed. Okay, so that is a things that why I emphasize on the transparency on information based on facts and figures, the real information, not to kind of propagate all this kind of untrue information. So you see, the special rights is in our constitution. Okay, even you sign the ISET, it is still there. So, but this misleading agenda have made, especially the rural Malay Bumiputra, they are fearful because you are losing your rights and privileges and benefits. So I hope all those who make false propaganda on this, sinful, if I may use the word. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I think the ISET is being used as a sort of a vehicle to stop the NEP from progressing further. I think we have discussed this, yes, some shortcomings and other things we need to arrange, and then we go forward within the structure. Yes, you rightly pointed out, Dr. Janice, that the signing of the ISET doesn't take away the constitutional right of the special rights of the Malays and the Bumiputras. With that, I think we are coming almost to the end point. We have budgeted a little bit longer, but I think we have had a wonderful discussion. I think all the panel members, I want to thank you. I'm sure Zaim is going to come and thank you one more time, but as moderator, you have made my life not miserable. You have been very compliant. Tan Sri Sharif Kassim, Dato Sri Nazir Razak, Dato Rajah Rasiah, and then Dr. Lee, and then Janice Nga. And so finally, I will once again thank all the people who have been following this online and for giving the comments and passing on the questions. I would like to, Tan Sri Michael, you're still there? If not, I hand over this to
Yes,
Zaim.
yeah, but let Zaim do the closing.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
fine.
Let Zaim do the closure, and then we will say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sri Mohamed Barauta, and to all the other members. It was a very interesting discussion. We started this at about 2:30. Yes, sir. Just looking at my time, 2:30. And despite the rain and the weather that we've had, we've weathered through this very interesting discussion. We started off with Tan Sri Makalu giving the opening remarks on sort of expectations of the session, and some preliminary remarks by Dr. Sri Barauta in terms of the situation when it comes to the NEP. And then we had some prepared remarks by Tan Sri Dato Muhammad Sharif bin Muhammad Kassim, the former Secretary General KSU of MOF, Ministry of Finance, and a very balanced view of the NEP. And I thought that brought home this is not a straightforward issue. And I think a lot of the audience will agree that this is not a straightforward issue. This has been going on for 50 years, and Tan Sri Sharif brought a very balanced view in terms of the formulation of the NEP. And I thought it was very interesting that to hear someone that was actually on the table, there was in the policy making table to actually go through this. Then we had some remarks by Dr. Sri Muhammad Nazir bin Abdul Razak, founding partner and chairman of Ikhlas Capital, but also credit to Dr. Sri Nazir, who's also been talking about NEP for a long time. I think Dr. Sri Nazir also mentioned a lot of things that I think we've not heard before this. When I think Dr. Sri was mentioning in the Q&A about how his father, Tunaza, was actually more of a pragmatic person as opposed to what people paint him to be, an ideological person. And that, and if it was still alive, probably look at it from a different lens and have a different view on the NEP. Then we had a very interesting presentation by Dr. Hwok-Aun, Senior Fellow of Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, and also Senior Fellow for IDS Malaysia. And Dr. Lee had a very interesting presentation. I thought it was very interesting how Dr. Lee was mentioning about the need for us to look at the NEP without being driven by sentiments. And Dr. Lee was mentioning about there are a number of myths when it comes to the NEP, including that it only benefited the elite, when in fact it's a very comprehensive program that benefited and the community. And also, I think Dr. Lee, credit to him, was giving context in terms of the newer policies that need to look at reforming the NEP as opposed to replacing it with supposedly another system. So we need to consider the role of Putra and also the how we're going to empower this community. Then we had Prof. Dato Rajah, Distinguished Professor of Economics in Asia Europe Institute, Universiti of Malaya, which I thought was very interesting. This Professor Rajah gave a very good view in terms of how does Malaysia, where does Malaysia stand in the context of the region where other economies have advanced forward, whereas Malaysia is still stuck in this discourse on NEP for the past 50 years, whereas countries like South Korea have advanced forward through very innovative economic policies. This was also in the case of Singapore. Then we have Dr. Janice, Associate Professor in Planning and Development Economics, Faculty of Business, Economics and Accountancy, Universiti Malaysia Sabah, UMS. And Dr. Janice, I thought, was very honest in her thoughts in terms of giving a viewpoint of the NEP. And I thought the very interesting part was the 3R, Dr. Janice. I think Dr. Janice mentioned about the 3R, race, religion, and region. It's something that I think for many of us on Semenanjung Malaysia would not appreciate. But I think the dimension of having the Sabah and Sarawak angle when it comes to NEP also was something that I think I've not heard. I don't think many of the participants here else have also heard of. So we'd like to thank all the participants for very interesting and very insightful points on the NEP. And I obviously like to thank Dato' Sri Muhammad Barauta for moderating superbly and excellently moderating this session. I thought I don't think I'm young, but I think looking at Dato' Sri's energy and moderating this event for the past 2 hours, more than 2 hours, I think that was superb. Thank you so much, Dato' Sri Iqbal, for moderating this session. And before we close the session, I'd like to invite all of the participants here today to visit the KSI Strategic Institute for Asia Pacific's website, www.kasi.asia. For events, we actually have a lot of events coming up in the next few weeks and in the next few months. So please go to the website, visit our website, kasi.asia, as we have many of these events, summits, and also conferences and forums, as well as roundtables for us to discuss issues that pertain to the economy and also the region. So with that, I'd like to thank all the participants, all the role players today, Tan Sri Michael Yeo, Dato' Sri Iqbal Rautan, and all the panel for making time and also to for this discussion. And with that, thank you, and we'll see you in the next event happening soon.
Stay safe.